Man, it is a glorious time to be a retro gamer these days. There's all kinds of platforms that you can pick up that will play old cartridges. There's collected little mini consoles with lots of classic games on them. And you've got companies like Konami releasing anniversary collections. I've got the Castlevania one. I'll talk to you guys about that one in a little bit. But right now I want to talk about the Contra Anniversary Collection, which was revealed as part of the Nintendo press conference video at E3. And they were also announcing the new Contra game that's coming up a little bit later on. Now, the Contra Anniversary Collection is available for everything. It's on the Xbox and the PlayStation. It's on Steam. You can play this anywhere you want to, but I think it's a pretty freaking perfect fit on Nintendo Switch. It is an amazing trip through these terrific, completely radical and awesome games. Like, if you ever use the words radical and awesome to describe a video game, the best franchise to sort of earn that title is Contra, because it's so outrageous and so over the top and so comical in its insanity. Bullets flying everywhere, upgrades that give you just scattershot bullet hell, lasers everywhere, you're fighting robots. In some of them you can play as a robot. This is an incredible franchise, and it started in the 80s in the arcade. You get two arcade games. You get the original Contra and you get Super Contra, and they're all framed to be in a vertical arcade cabinet, so they're kind of longer than they are wider, which is a little bit weird. And Contra eventually came to the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Famicom in Japan, and Contra 2 came to the NES as well as Super C, which is also included on there. Now, when you go from the arcade games to the NES games, you notice the degradation in the overall graphical polish, but what's really extraordinary is all of the action is retained, you know? Even if you dumb it down to easy like I had to, because these games are still extraordinarily difficult. They're so punishing. It's like one little tiny bullet gets you, boom! Dead, start again. You know, there's so much of that. Oh, I've gone through all my continues. I got to start all that whole level again. There's a lot of that frustration. That exists. That's part of the fun. That's part of the enduring engagement of these excellent titles. Not only do we get the NES games on there, I think there's like 10 main games, and then there's about 5 or 6 Japanese versions of these main games. So we obviously jump from the NES days to the Super Nintendo days and get the exquisite Contra 3 Alien Wars, which brought all kinds of flashy new technology, all kinds of scaling and rotational stuff, and it just looks amazing. It still looks amazing in 2019. When you pop in Contra 3, you're still like, wow, what a cool looking game, and holy crap, it's hard. And holy crap, is there a ton of action in there, you know, from different perspectives. That was always the cool thing with Contra. You know, you think you got it all figured out, you're dodging the bullets, you're jumping on platforms, and you're making your way through, and then they switch up the whole perspective and they kind of create a pseudo 3D thing where you're racing down a maze and taking out targets and trying to avoid stuff. I gotta tell you, as I played through all of these games with my Nintendo controller on the Switch, I was having, quite a bit of difficulty with the analog thumbstick, and then trying to retrain myself to play these games with the D-pad, which doesn't feel, at least, you know, as organic and as familiar to me in these days as it did back when I was playing on the NES and the Super Nintendo. So I was struggling, man. I was struggling to get my timing right and to kind of get my positioning right, because you're shooting in all 8 directions. So sometimes you're going up a slope or a hill and you got to shoot back down towards you, or sometimes you're jumping up and shooting down, and it became a little bit tricky, and there were a lot of moments of like, okay, I'll start that again. But thankfully, if you get really frustrated with one Contra, it's like Baskin-Robbins of Contra here. You just pop in another game. What I thought was really cool was that they also included a Game Boy game. I think it's called Operation C. I'm trying to remember all the titles. Operation C for the Game Boy. And it looked great. Obviously everything has been stripped of color and background detail, but it still had retained all of the action and the over-the-top carnage of the Contra games that you know and love, and it performed quite well. And, maybe less enemies and less conflict on screen, but it was still a very fun game to play. And it really made me think that if we have games like this, and I think there's a Game Boy game on the Castlevania collection as well, why don't we have systems that allow us to access all of these games, the whole lineup? I know it's great that we're getting these little mini games and these collections and stuff, but why can't we, in 2019, if we want to play any game that came out for the Game Boy, we should be able to buy it and play it and carry it with us. But we can't, and I digress. what I was really, really excited to play, because I had kind of shifted over to the Super Nintendo when I picked up the Genesis first, and then I shifted over to the Super Nintendo. So I remember buying Contra 3 and being so happy with it, but I had never played Contra Hardcore, and I know it's one of the games that's going to be on the Sega Genesis Mini, and I've got one of those pre-ordered, so I'm looking forward to playing it there too. But it handles beautifully on the Switch, and it's a great game, and it plays a little bit differently than everything else. You could play as a wolf or a robot, which is just awesome. And I tweeted that maybe the best character select screen ever, where you're going between the male soldier, the female soldier, the wolf, or the robot. Super cool. I thought that was super fun. And then they've got a couple of Probotector games, which are the, I think, European versions of Contra, but with everybody's a robot. And those were weird. They're exactly like Hardcore or Alien Wars, except everybody's a robot. And they're jumping into the tanks, and they have all of the different perspective changes and all that stuff, but you're robots, which is cool, which is fine. Feels a little bit, I don't know, kind of gimmicky that we're playing the same game, but with like a different skin on there. And that's kind of what you get when you jump into the Japanese versions of these games as well, because they're pretty much identical, but they might have some slight detail variance in the background or something like that. And the collection suggests that you should play a little game of spot the difference when you're jumping between these variations, which is pretty cute, pretty clever. In addition to all of these games, and it's a nice, big, hefty collection, doesn't include the modern-day Contra titles. It's really kind of concluding in the 16-bit era. But in addition to a nice collection of great Contra classics, you also get a little history on each of the games. You get kind of the manual on how to play each of these games. Good luck to you, by the way. Have I mentioned how hard these titles are? And then there's also an interview with Nobuya Nakazato, who is overseeing all of Contra, and he's actually been a designer on the Contra games since Contra 3. He's working on Road Core right now, so that was a pretty cool dive into the history of the series. And they've also got a lot of the graph paper and a lot of the design documents all scanned in there that you can swish through on a digital page. Very nice touch. Really, really wonderful collection. Konami, I know you've done this kind of thing in the past, but now more than ever, we need companies that have been around for decades to collect their work and release things either digitally or in physical form so that we don't forget the past. These are incredible games that influence so many designers and so much of modern game development. So many indie titles, hell, even like big budget titles were influenced by a lot of these concepts that these little teams of 5 or 6 people were putting together and revolutionizing the medium, and getting people to drop quarters in or spend 50 or 60 bucks on old cartridges back in the day. These games were so captivating, made by such passionate people. I really applaud the efforts to not let us forget about this incredible stuff. I really encourage more companies to do things like this. I loved my time with the Contra Anniversary Collection, and I'm saying that as if I'm wrapping up, but there's no way I'm going to ever stop playing these games, mostly because they're freaking hard. I'm going to give the Contra Anniversary Collection a 9 out of 10.